Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
History is a delicate tapestry, woven together by the victors and, at times, unraveled at the expense of the vanquished. Within this intricate web of recorded events, there exist entire narratives buried beneath layers of omission, distortion, and deliberate manipulation. One such tragic story is that of Native American history, a history that, despite its immense depth and significance, has been systematically erased from mainstream discourse. The erasure of Native American history is not just a matter of forgotten battles or lost traditions. It is an ongoing suppression of an entire civilization's contributions, sufferings, and triumphs. For centuries, the rich and diverse histories of indigenous peoples across the Americas have been obscured by colonization, forced assimilation, and cultural destruction. This erasure has not been accidental. It has been carefully constructed through legal policies, educational curricula, media misrepresentation, and outright destruction of historical records. The consequences of this deliberate distortion extend far beyond academia. They shape the way modern society perceives Native Americans, often reducing them to stereotypes or rendering them invisible altogether. The process of erasing Native American history did not happen overnight. It was a systematic, relentless effort spanning generations, orchestrated by colonial powers, expansionist governments, and even contemporary institutions that fail to recognize the full scope of indigenous experiences. Native American voices have been silenced in history books, their lands stolen and renamed, their spiritual practices outlawed, and their contributions to civilization whitewashed. This is not merely a case of historical oversight. It is an ongoing act of suppression that continues to marginalize indigenous communities today. Yet, despite these efforts, Native American history refuses to be fully erased. Indigenous scholars, activists, and storytellers continue to reclaim their past, resurrecting stories that were meant to be forgotten. Oral traditions, archaeological discoveries, and modern resistance movements challenge the false narratives that have long dominated historical records. Through their resilience, the truth about Native American history is emerging from the shadows, demanding recognition and justice. What follows is an exploration of the shocking truths about how Native American history was systematically erased. This is not just a recounting of historical injustices, but an urgent call to recognize and rectify the narratives that have shaped our understanding of the past. It is time to unearth the truth and give voice to the stories that were meant to be silenced. The systematic erasure of Native American history began the moment European explorers set foot on the Americas. The arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 marked the beginning of an era of conquest, exploitation, and cultural destruction. From the earliest days of European colonization, Native American societies were portrayed as primitive, disposable, or non-existent, paving the way for their lands to be stolen and their histories rewritten. European settlers viewed the New World as a blank slate, disregarding the fact that indigenous civilizations had flourished for thousands of years. The Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, the Mississippian mound builders, and countless other indigenous nations had built vast cities, developed complex political systems, and cultivated agricultural techniques that would later influence global food production. Yet, despite their achievements, colonial narratives deliberately depicted them as backward or savage, justifying European conquest and domination. One of the most insidious methods of erasing Native American history was the destruction of indigenous records and oral traditions. Spanish conquistadors and missionaries, in particular, played a significant role in eradicating indigenous knowledge. Sacred codices of the Maya and Aztecs were burned by Spanish priests, who saw them as pagan relics that needed to be destroyed to make way for Christianity. Oral histories, which had been passed down for generations, were dismissed as unreliable and unworthy of academic recognition. The result was the loss of invaluable historical records that could have provided deeper insights into indigenous civilizations. In addition to the destruction of indigenous knowledge, European colonial powers imposed their own historical narratives, distorting the realities of Native American history. The doctrine of discovery, a legal principle rooted in European expansionism, legitimized the seizure of indigenous lands by declaring that non-Christian peoples had no legal claim to their territories. This ideology was further reinforced by policies such as manifest destiny, which encouraged westward expansion at the expense of Native American sovereignty. Through these legal frameworks, indigenous histories were rewritten to portray colonization as an inevitable and just process, rather than a violent invasion that led to displacement and genocide. One of the most effective tools in the erasure of Native American history has been the education system. From the earliest days of American schooling, textbooks have largely omitted or misrepresented indigenous experiences. For decades, history books portrayed Native Americans as obstacles to progress, framing westward expansion as a noble pursuit rather than a brutal campaign of land theft and forced removals. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of this erasure is the myth of the vanishing Indian. Many history books have suggested that Native Americans simply faded away after the arrival of European settlers, rather than being actively displaced and exterminated. This narrative allows mainstream society to ignore the ongoing struggles of indigenous communities, perpetuating the false belief that Native cultures are relics of the past rather than living, thriving societies. Boarding schools played a crucial role in suppressing Native American identity. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Native children were forcibly taken from their families and placed in government-run boarding schools, where they were forbidden from speaking their languages or practicing their cultural traditions. These schools aimed to assimilate indigenous children into Western society by erasing their cultural identities. Many children suffered physical and emotional abuse, and thousands never returned home. The legacy of these boarding schools continues to impact indigenous communities today, as many struggle to reclaim languages and traditions that were forcibly taken from them. Modern education continues to fall short in addressing Native American history accurately. While some progress has been made, many schools still teach a Eurocentric version of history that downplays indigenous contributions and the brutal realities of colonization. Few states require comprehensive Native American history in their curricula, leaving students with a skewed understanding of the past. The erasure of Native American history in schools is not just an academic issue. It is a systemic failure that perpetuates ignorance and injustice. Beyond historical narratives, the physical erasure of Native American history can be seen in the destruction of sacred sites, the renaming of indigenous lands, and the appropriation of Native culture. Many indigenous sacred sites have been desecrated or built over, further disconnecting Native communities from their historical and spiritual heritage. The renaming of indigenous lands is another form of historical erasure. Many places that once held indigenous names were renamed after European settlers or events, effectively erasing their indigenous histories. Even national parks and monuments that celebrate America's natural beauty often fail to acknowledge the Native peoples who once called those lands home. Meanwhile, Native American culture has been appropriated and commodified, further distorting historical narratives. From sports team mascots to Halloween costumes, Native imagery is often reduced to caricatures that perpetuate harmful stereotypes. This trivialization of Native culture serves to further erase the complex histories and lived experiences of indigenous peoples. The erasure of Native American history is not an accident. It is a deliberate act that has shaped the way society understands the past. By confronting these realities, we can begin to correct the historical record and acknowledge the resilience of indigenous communities. The truth cannot be erased forever, and as long as Native voices continue to rise, the stories that were meant to be forgotten will endure.